Good evening. Welcome to the Fabulous Kings Fund. Am I shot? Okay, that's fine. Welcome to the Fabulous Kings Fund, where tonight we will be exploring the inner depths of public health. But first, a word from our sponsor. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michael Thiel. I took him by surprise.
This is the first time he's remembered for the last 5, I think.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. We're running out of time.
Well, as you can see, people often say, why do we put up with this ritual abuse? And we don't really do sponsorship. What we really want to do is to give everybody examples of what really good practice is, and the practice can vary in all sorts of ways. So tonight is public health. We've had Lord Carter talking about improvement. We've had Matthew Swindells talking about how do you make the NHS digital. And tonight we're lucky enough to have Shirley Cramer with us, and it's for this reason that we put up with him. Thank you.
There's nothing like a good introduction, and that was nothing like a good introduction. Anyway, listen, it's my great privilege and pleasure to welcome Dame, soon to be announced, Shirley Cramer, who is the Chief Executive of Her Majesty's Royal Academy of Public Health. Is that right?
Not quite.
Is it close enough?
Royal Society for Public Health. Not quite.
Which started off as the Sanitary Club, didn't it?
It's got a great history.
I know. I was reading about how I thought, how the hell did you end up being royal? Anything really? Because you're a lobby group, but you pinched it, didn't you?
I don't think that's true, Roy. We deserved it.
So tell us. So you nicked your title from the Sanitary Club.
I think it was the Institute of Hygiene.
No, but there was a merger. It was the sanitary. I remember the word sanitary and the hygiene thing, and you put them together, and it became. You got a Royal Charter in 1863.
So we're 161 years old.
Yeah.
So actually, the oldest public health organisation in the world, just beating one of the American Public Health Association.
Yeah.
But it's had loads of different names. Over the years.
Well, it's mainly because public health has largely failed, isn't it, really? It's not achieved very much. I mean, we're all too fat, our diets are all terrible.
Speak for yourself,
Most
Roy.
people, as you said, just sit up straight and breathe in. I mean, well, we'll get onto that in a minute. Listen, where did it all start for you? Because you're from up north, aren't you, really?
I'm from Cumbria.
I know you've tried to become
Cumbrian.
southern and posh. No, you're in Gerrard's Cross, but we know really that you're...
No, I'm from West Cumbria,
Yeah.
the very, very unposh part of the Lake District, the strip down by the coast that was mining steel.
Yeah, a legacy
Industrial.
of public health problems. Yeah,
A legacy,
yeah. And then you went to uni?
Yep, I went, actually before that I spent a year in the States when I was 17 as a foreign student, which was...
Now, how did that happen? Because I was interested, because we'll come on to that in a minute, because you got your master's.
Yeah.
Is it an MBA or a master's?
Master of Science.
Yeah,
in Columbia University.
In Columbia University, where you've got some very posh alumni there. Warren Buffet was...
Indeed.
Yes. A Warren all-you-can-eat for £1, yes. Yeah, you didn't meet... No, he was there in 57, it's much too early. Yeah, much too early for you.
It's slightly early, thank you, Roy, but...
Yeah,
a bit early, but...
How did a 17-year-old lass from downtown Cumbria end up in America?
So there was a program which is still running in the States called the American Field Service Scholarship Program, and actually was set up by ambulance drivers during the First World War who didn't want to fight but didn't want to be conscientious objectors, and believed that actually you could stop war by people understanding each other from different nations. So they set up this program called American Field Service, where Americans came to Europe and beyond, and those of us in Europe went and lived with a family for a year in the States.
And who was that through your school?
It was through the school. I saw it advertised and applied for it.
Yeah.
Thought it would be interesting, and it was. I lived with a very big
There was a
family.
lot of that going on. When I was a kid, I went to on a thing called Jeunesse Reconstruction, Youth and Reconstruction, and I worked in a summer camp with German, French and Italian kids of my own age. And of course at that time, just after the war, it was thought, well, that was kind of an edgy thing to do.
Yeah.
My dad was a window cleaner. He was very keen for me to do it. He somehow or other arranged for me we had to go and buy all the kit for me to travel and all that stuff. I mean, it would have been for you to go to the States, it would have been a big adventure.
From West Cumbria, it was certainly a big adventure because we had to go to Oxford for 2 days to be told what it was like to live in America, and then we got on a chartered plane. It had stopped in Paris, so there were all the French, and then the Brits got on, and then off we went to New York, where they then put us in a college for another 2 days where we met all the South Americans and the others and learnt about what it would be like to live in America and how we needed to behave and what would be expected of us.
It's really exciting, isn't it? So you eat hamburgers and watch movies.
Well, we got on a bus. I then got on a bus, and because that was the cheapest way to get us around. And it's a long way by bus from New York to Chicago. And then when you get there, off the bus, there's your family waiting to greet you, and you're going to live with them for a year. So it was quite, I was quite young and inexperienced. This was quite a...
So you were 17, you'd done your...
I'd done my lower sixth.
Yeah.
So I was
it
literally
GCSEs
missing my...
then, or was it matriculation?
It was year 12. So I'd finished year 12 when I was my last year at school. So I spent it in the States.
So that was a real treat, wasn't it, to be able to do that?
It was a growing up for me.
Did you enjoy it?
I loved it, actually. I was homesick for 3 months. And then once I got into the swing of things, one of the things I was expected to do was to go and talk to various societies about what it was like to live in England and what the English system was. And so that was quite an interesting thing to have to do, to be able to compare. And of course, it was quite a long time ago, and the high school kids in Chicago hadn't met anybody from England, and so they wanted to know, did we have cars? Did we? And my first day of high school was very memorable because I'd been to a grammar school, and we had a very strict school uniform, including a hat and the whole thing. And I knew you could sort of wear what you want, but I wasn't that comfortable and it was hot, in any old clothes. So I wore my navy blue skirt and a white blouse, and I felt slightly out of it, and I was worried about speaking. And so we're all waiting for the teacher to come in, and they're in halter neck tops and shorts, and the teacher came in, and I stood up. Nobody else stood up. This wasn't the way they did it, so I immediately drew attention to myself, and that's how it started, the cultural difference.
Did they start the day singing the American national anthem?
No, we looked in a corner where it was played and did this, and had to learn that.
And what was the standard of living? Was it higher or different? Or
It was different. It was just very different. So, I was with a very middle-class family, Catholic family. They had 6 children. I was the oldest of 3 from lower middle-class family, I guess. And they were suburban America, which was a nice place to be in those days. Yeah. Huge high school, 15 in those days compared to my grammar school.
And you went to school?
Just 1 year.
Yeah. And what did you learn? Did you?
Well,
was the education system here ahead of or behind?
We were certainly in those days. I'm not sure. Certainly by the time you get to master's level, they're way ahead, I think, honestly. But at school level, definitely not, because you don't specialise as early. So when I produced my first bit of homework, I did it in the same way I'd have done it at the grammar school, so sort of 6 or 7 pages on some book we were supposed to write. And I got called in to the English teacher, and he said, can I just show you something? Can I show you what other people have written? Yes. A paragraph, 2 paragraphs at the most. He said, I actually couldn't have written this. Don't worry about it, you'll be fine. And so then I realised, okay, there were some things I wasn't going to be so good at, but actually I could concentrate on the things that were new to me and learn about that, and not worry so much about writing, 7-page essays.
So you stayed there for a year, you came back?
Came back and I did my A-levels and then went to university.
Yeah. And what did you study at university?
I studied applied social studies. So in those days, that was the BA CQSW. So when you came out of the 4-year course, you were a qualified social worker. And then I went, in those days, again, they were desperate, just as they are now, I think, for social workers. So local authorities were lining up to offer you the qualified people a job.
And what was you? I mean, you wouldn't have had an unsupervised caseload, but was it busy then? Where were you?
Do you know, I was in Southall area office, so my friends and I came down. We wanted to be in London, came to London, and when I think I was 22 probably, I had a huge caseload. I was emergency duty team. Because I had some mental health experience, one of my placements had been with eating disorders, that I was the mental health specialist in the emergency duty team at 22. And it was possibly the most stressful thing I've ever done. I have huge time for social workers. I think they get immense, they need sort of admiration and respect for the things that they deal with. But I had a caseload taking children into care. I spent half my time at court. I did adoption, but the mental health is the one I remember the most because, you know, I was responsible for signing people, in sectioning people.
You were?
I was. Mm-hmm.
It's not like that now, is it? It's much
so,
more.
well, it needed to have a doctor and a social worker, a third person. Yeah. So, you know, I was at 22 in ambulances sectioning people.
So you did that for a while.
Yeah.
And then I'm interested to know how you got back to the States, because you've been...
So, well, isn't interesting? I got married and I was a trailing spouse.
Well, your husband's name is Carl.
He is.
And there is a famous American footballer called Carl Cramer. Did you know that?
I didn't actually know
and
that.
when I was researching, I thought, I wonder if you're married to the famous American footballer.
Interesting.
Yeah, you married the wrong Carl.
Obviously.
Because your Carl has just fallen off his bike.
He has, yes. Just to say, we've had an
NHS
NHS
and if you're watching,
experience.
Carl, we're really sorry.
Yes,
and Shirley's a rotten nurse.
Yeah, not so good.
Yeah.
A lot of respect for carers as well.
Yeah.
No, he was offered a job in New York, and we just thought, why not?
What does he do?
He's in finance. It was corporate finance, and it just seemed like a great opportunity to go and live in the States, to go and live in New York City.
Yeah.
And partly because I'd lived there before, I was thought it would be exciting.
Did you have connections there still?
We have loads now, but at the time when we first moved, we knew nobody in New York, and so it was a very interesting time in our lives, and I didn't have a work permit, so I didn't know I didn't have a work permit. He had one, and I didn't realise that I couldn't get a job in social services. That's how naive we were. And so I worked off the books for a few months in a store and applied to Columbia University in that time because I wanted to do my master's. And it was a great opportunity.
Did you have to pay for your master's?
We did.
Because it's a private university. It's unusual. It's a private
Columbia
university. Yeah.
It's a big, private, wealthy university. I think I got a small scholarship, but they allowed me to do the 2-year master's in 13 months because of my applied social studies course. There were certainly things that I'd already done, so they allowed me to do it in 13 months. But it was 7 days a week for 13 months. I've never worked so hard in my life.
What did you write about? Did you do a thesis? What was it?
I did. I wrote... you won't have heard of Bertha Reynolds, but Bertha Reynolds was a social reformer. A social reformer, and she worked in the mills in Massachusetts. So I wrote a lot about her. I was interested in social policy, and I was so fortunate because it was right at the end of the careers of some very really important people who'd been involved in the Johnson White House. So they were in their mid-70s, but they're the ones. I mean, if you look at social policy in the USA now, these are the people that put in Chapter 1, all of the things that are the federal preventive programs go back to the Johnson era. And these were mainly amazing men, some of whom had come from Europe. There's one guy, Al, who had been in concentration camps. These were Jewish intellectuals, really, who'd written these policy papers. And so I was, this would be the last year they were teaching. So I've just felt, humbled to have sort of been at the end of their career and listening to their talks about it. And I was always very interested in at the sort of policy level in the States, because so much is done at local level or at, regional level. And the federal piece, which is where you say, how do we make something happen nationally? The things that we consider national standards are quite difficult And so you often get the discussion around an unfunded mandate. That means that there's some policy, but the federal government have put no money behind it.
Well, most of our policy here is like that, isn't it?
We could say
Why don't we
that.
just call it unfunded mandate?
An unfunded mandate,
Yeah. So you got kicked out of America. Life brought you back here.
Well, I went back again. So left in '86 for jobs back in the UK, and then.
Did you come back as a social worker?
I came. Actually, I really wanted to work for New York City, so I wanted to go back into the public sector, and I wanted to be a social worker in the but I couldn't because I wasn't American.
Just pause you there. I mean, the kind of social work that you would do there, one imagines there's a huge kind of schizophrenic community, isn't there? You've got very wealthy, high-end New Yorkers, and then you've got not much of a middle class and a lot of poverty, and not much in the way of support, really.
No, it a very complicated system, but really what I was interested to be able to compare it and to understand it, but because I wasn't American, in those days you couldn't work for the public sector. So that's when I started my career in the voluntary sector, because I got immediately picked up to work in a large settlement house on the east side, and I worked there in program planning and fundraising and just sort of the architecture of what it is to run a voluntary sector organisation.
Well, it laid the foundation, really, for what has become your career.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're picking up our story where Shirley has, having gone to America, come back with her master's, and came back here and did what?
So I worked in fundraising, actually, because having lived in the States, that's what people wanted to hire me for,
because they knew how to fundraise,
because the Americans know how to fundraise, and I'd done a bit of that. I mean, actually, in the States, if you can't fundraise, you would never end up as a CEO of a voluntary sector organisation. It just wouldn't happen. So it was good training, and I didn't particularly want to do it, but I worked at Muscular Dystrophy in fundraising for maybe a year and a half, and I had my first child and left, because I thought, well, maybe I'll stay at home. I've got two daughters,
Olivia,
Grace and Olivia.
Grace and Olivia.
And so at that time, I thought I didn't know what I was going to do, but honestly, it sounds awful, but within 3 months, I was working again, created a consultancy with a woman I knew who had been at the Foreign Office, and then she'd been in voluntary sector. We had complementary skills. It was the time that Mrs. Thatcher was getting rid of a lot of, voluntary sector organisations were really in a mess at that time because the funding, so austerity and funding was going down. And so what we were able to do is look at, so what do you need to do within your organisation to create a sustainable charity, a sustainable voluntary sector. So between my experience and hers, we actually did quite a lot of work. And that was going really well and very flexible, and then we moved back to the States. Another job moved back to the States. So I've kind of been across both areas quite a lot.
That was your husband's job?
Yeah. But then, of course, by this time, I was pregnant with my second child, and of course we knew New York then. We had friends there. It seemed a lot less.
Get a green card?
And I got a green card.
Your daughter was born there?
And my second daughter was born there.
She American or is she
American?
She's
both.
American?
She's got both
passports.
Both have both passports now, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and then you came back. Now, what interested me, you got involved with learning disability, didn't you?
So I was, when I went back to work in New York, and I knew a few people, and I was recommended as CEO of the National Centre for Learning Disabilities, which was in New York. And I was not an expert in learning disabilities, learning differences, so dyslexia and other things. But what they wanted was a competent manager, if you like, a person who could run the organisation, because there were quite a lot of skilled people in the organisation on the subject matter. And that was a very interesting role, because it sort of got me into public policy in the States a bit. It was the start of an interesting journey. So I opened a Washington office for this particular organisation, because actually one of their missions was around policy and changing public policy in this area. And in order to do that, you needed to be in the capital. And so we started looking at all the different ways to improve practice. So what you want at the end of the day, if you're like me and you go into social work or anything, you're there to make a difference. And so I've always believed that policy, if you could really change policy, that can make a difference, particularly in the States. So we put together a summit while I ran this organisation. And what that did was brought together during the first Clinton administration all the people in research around learning disabilities, the people who, the policymakers, the people on the ground, so people who are on practicing, and then we looked at, so what do consumers think? You know, what do mums and dads and other people think? And we created this event in Washington that was televised in the end, and it was the first term of Bill Clinton's presidency, so it was a great time to be in Washington because they were really open to these things. We had Hillary Clinton
open it. They were pushing for healthcare, weren't they?
They were pushing for healthcare, and she was a big children's advocate. And what we were trying to do...
Sorry to interrupt you, did you meet a woman there called Donna Shalala?
I did meet Donna Shalala.
Yeah.
She spoke at this summit.
She's good, isn't she?
She's fantastic.
Yeah,
Takes a village to raise a child, Donna Shalala.
That's right, yeah.
She was Health and Human Services. Robert Reich spoke. He was running the...
yeah.
You know,
well, Shalala came over here, and I met her through that, really. But I thought, wow, what a very powerful lady.
She's amazing.
Yeah, and a great friend of the Clintons, of course.
Very good friend of the Clintons.
And why do you think it was the Clintons didn't do healthcare?
Oh, you know, it was 92, and being a sort of new person in Washington was quite interesting to watch it because there were a lot of people who'd been there a long time, and I had a couple of senators on my board, the National Centre for Learning Disabilities, so who knew how Washington worked. And what they told me was that you know, when you're campaigning and you've got all your campaign people, you owe them and you bring them in and you give them jobs. So there were all these people from Arkansas in Washington who really didn't know how Washington works. And that's really tricky because it's a difficult city. And you need a few problem solvers, integrators, people who can, you know, kick around a bit in Congress.
Or a civil service.
Or a civil service. And it was very difficult in that first term. And one of the reasons they didn't get a lot of things done was because they had some great, nice people, but not the right people. They made good appointments in the ministries, but the people in the White House at that time were not effective. And probably all of you are West Wing supporters.
Well, we are. You know,
West Wing, but you'll see it's really important.
But they had 2 terms at it, didn't they, really? I suppose the thing is they laid the groundwork for Obamacare.
They did.
And generally speaking, if you come in second, you're more likely to be successful. I remember Brian Wolfson saying to me once, pioneers get arrows in their arses, and that's true.
And they really did.
Yeah.
And so they had 2 things going for them, and they had a sort of, before the Tea Party movement, but the really right wing of the Republican Party under Newt Gingrich started getting really, really active about that time. And he began to lose because they weren't pushing things through. And so what happened was that they lost Congress, you know, during that first term, and that was catastrophic because, of course, then you couldn't get things through. And in my job, it was very interesting because somebody had said to me, and I wish I could remember who, remember, if you're here on an issue based, you must be bipartisan. You might not want to go and talk to the Republicans because you see all the Democrats here, but be bipartisan. So I duly did that, being a sort of do my homework sort of person. I went to visit Bob Dole, and I went to visit a few other, Orrin Hatch, who's still in the Senate. I went to see Newt Gingrich. And of course, he was nobody who was progressive or on the left or a Democrat really wanted to see because, you know, his policies were pretty awful. But I went.
So and this blonde English lady turned up.
What we were doing, you know, and what we were doing. But what happened was then, never expecting that the Republicans would get Congress. And then when they did, what he'd said was that he wasn't going to talk to anybody. he hadn't met when they were in opposition, which meant we were in a fantastic position
Well done.
because we were the only
That's
people
very
that
good advice,
met him.
yeah.
And so I thought it was
Yeah.
really good advice. So we were then able to work with them to get the summit going and to get what really was some No Child Left Behind Act was what we were aiming for, and that did get through.
Yeah.
And this was about children with, disabilities getting some standard support across school.
And when I know you've written a book about learning disability. I mean, and it's a hell of a book. I mean, it's 360 odd pages. It's a proper book. It's still on Amazon at the full price. I mean, all my books have been remaindered. I'm very pissed off about this, I must say. And it's
I'm amazed to hear that, actually,
It is,
that it's still being so.
and it's what I like about it is, I mean, it really gets under the hood, doesn't it, of learning disability. Where did all that come from?
So here's
How
what,
did you know that stuff?
So here's what I think about how we do
Did
things.
you ever meet Nan Carl in your travels? No, she's
No.
an American expert on learning disability, and she worked for me when I was running a hospital. But I mean, learning disability, you're watching, learning disability is your thing. What's it called? Something other learning disability, your book, what's it called?
Oh, it was called Learning Disabilities, Lifelong Issues.
That's it, Lifelong Issues, a great title. So if learning disability is your thing, go to Amazon now and buy this book now, because it's a fantastic book. I'm not sure, actually I'm sure, I mean the things have changed since you've written it.
Oh, yeah.
But what I liked about it is that it moves away from medicalising the care
Yeah.
of people with learning disability, which has always been the big problem. But so come on, where did all this come from?
So we took the view that if you wanted to move policy, you know how we all go to conferences and enjoy them and people speak, and what we wanted to do was to say, well, actually that doesn't work if you really want to change policy. How do we create something that will move things forward? So what we wanted was a blueprint for progress. So that's why we have the research and the policy and the practice, and then what people think about it. And then I had journalists on this. We called it a summit. People only got 10 minutes. We did it under Health and Human Services, employment. We did it under all the different areas. 10 minutes for those people who normally speak for an hour and a half to say, give us the nub of it. And then for the policy people to say, so from the research, what should the policy be? And the policy people, how do you put that in practice? And for then to say, how does that work for you as the mum and dad or the person with a learning disability? And then the journalist to sum up at the end. And that's where the book came from, that was the idea, and that was the background to No Child Left Behind. But we needed to have Republicans and Democrats on side, and we needed to really push the envelope. So it was a sort of, we called it a summit rather than a conference, because the purpose was to try and move the field forward.
I think it's really interesting, and it's a case study in how to do lobbying, isn't it? Which feeds into what you're doing now. I'll come on to more about the public health, but I think your background is so interesting, because then you got moved into dyslexia.
Yes.
Yes, is that
Yes,
right? I've got the
dyslexia
chronology
in action.
right.
Yeah, that's absolutely. When we moved back to the UK.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah,
you
10
did,
years.
You did dyslexia. Yeah.
I did.
And I speak as someone who, as a child, as a kid at school, was just thought of as thick, which is probably right as well. But I struggled.
I think so.
I struggled a lot with reading. I could do the numbers, I couldn't do the reading. It was only later in life when I realised what dyslexia was. You know, I realised why I couldn't do certain things, and I didn't know that I didn't know I couldn't do certain things. That's the thing about dyslexia. You don't really know until everybody takes the piss out of you, and then then it can be very depressing.
It can
very
be
upsetting.
very
And I don't know if you've seen, but I've done a YouTube on it for the Blonde Dyslexia Association.
the BDA or something.
Yeah.
No, it's an organisation that supports students, so diverse learners.
Right.
So I just told them my dyslexia story and told them that don't give a stuff, just do your thing.
I think I felt passionate about it because
But it
so
was
many
difficult.
children
Well,
were written off.
Yeah,
so
when you were
early.
doing it, Shirley, I mean, I'm not quite sure, this must have been, 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, it was.
It was very difficult. In a sense, diseases and illnesses and conditions go through fashions, don't they? And it's brutal to talk to them, talk about them in this way, because these are people's lives and their families. But we've had the kind of breast cancer fashion because it was made fashionable by the campaigners, the lobbyists, the awareness of it, and we've had other diseases, AIDS and HIV. I mean, you look at the fantastic job that the Terence Higgins Trust did, the textbook lobbying, and we'll talk about that as well later on. And somehow or other, dyslexia now it's become kind of topical, isn't it?
I think what's important, we started these award dinners, which were to showcase to young people that actually you could be really successful with dyslexia. And of course lots of people in the arts and architecture are well known, but actually doctors. I mean, one of my favourite stories is about Toby Cosgrove, who as CEO, just stood down as CEO of the Cleveland Clinic. And I lived in Cleveland for a little while and met him. And I was doing learning disabilities, understood a bit about dyslexia and got to know him. And he was running the heart surgery at Cleveland Clinic, and I couldn't understand why he was so interested in what I did, it seemed, compared to what he did. And it turned out, of course, that he was dyslexic. And the only reason that he got into medical school was because he'd been in Vietnam. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made the grades. He has now got 36 patents in heart surgery. When he was practicing in heart surgery, the #1 in the USA, and he was Obama's choice to lead the Veterans Admin. So this is a giant of a man in medicine, and he almost didn't get in because of his dyslexia. And he said to me, I worked twice as hard as everybody else just to get through the course. He said, I can do a 5-hour operation, I look at the heart and it just makes all sense to me, but when I have to call the wife or the family and I look at the name, I think, oh, how do you pronounce that? And I get all panicked.
I didn't know I had a problem. I just thought I was stupid and couldn't spell. Most of it manifests in the written word, which is what I do now every day. And a psychiatrist who was working for me in the trust looked at some of the stuff I'd written, and she said, I think you're dyslexic. I didn't know.
Yeah, that would have been pretty common, and that's a problem for so many children, that they aren't diagnosed quickly.
Yeah, I didn't know. It was too late by then. And they tried me with the blue glasses. Did you do blue glasses?
Yeah.
Blue glasses? Yeah, if you're watching, don't bother. Yeah, just go.
It works for some children, we need to say.
Well, it works for
Not
some.
for Roy, but for some.
Yeah. Yes, other glasses are available. Yeah, it didn't work for me. No, just get on with your life. That was my... get on with it. So that was interesting. So did you achieve anything with that, do you think?
Yeah, I think we did a lot of work with primary schools, so raised actually quite a lot of money, over £1 million, to put in mainstream schools, and it was an evaluated programme in primary, training the teaching assistants in how to support children who were being left behind slightly. So the important thing was to get in there early and to support those children. And a lot of that programme still remains in some of the schools around that. It's very important that, so that it's a big battle, of course, between phonics and real words. And phonics is hugely important for children with dyslexia.
There was a row about phonics just recently, wasn't there?
It was in The Economist, I think. There was an article, Yeah.
And of course, dyslexia, we can't get stuck on dyslexia, but it's just in my mind because it affects a lot of student nurses. Mm-hmm. And when they knew about me, that's how I got hooked into this. Student nurses had to, you have to make provision for them, and rightly so, in my view. So, okay, so you did dyslexia,
10 years,
sorted dyslexia out, and then what?
Well, then actually, it wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was asked by a headhunter if I would consider doing an interim role, and I thought, well, I hadn't really thought about that, because I travelled a bit. Yes.
Wow.
Imagine that.
That's posh,
Imagine
isn't it?
that.
Headhunter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Posh.
Imagine.
Yeah.
If I wanted to do an interim role for an adoption or maternity adoption cover, and it was Alzheimer's Research UK, and my mother had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
You've taken on all the easy jobs, haven't you? Yeah.
And so, I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
I went in there for
Now,
about
when
8-9
was
months.
this? What
So
was-
this was 2012,
Again, it's
and in a very short
It
time.
was
I'm now on the board. So.
before Alzheimer's got.
Well, it was
I mean,
just as the Dementia Challenge was coming on board.
Yeah.
So it was at that time, and it was sort of the time had come for Alzheimer's, I think, at that point. And it was very lucky for me to be in there because I got a chance to help get the chairman of Alzheimer's Research UK, who is an amazing chairman, and
Who is
David Mayhew, who is head at Casanova.
Yeah, Casanova. Yeah.
He's a city
Yeah.
fixture, but he's a wonderful guy, and he's been a particularly great chairman around the Dementia Challenge. And
let's just reel this back a bit, because you were with the Alzheimer's Society?
No, Alzheimer's Research UK
Yeah.
was for that interim
Yeah,
period.
because
as
I mean,
CEO.
I think that's kind of confusing for the public, because actually we're talking about dementia here, aren't we? There are 7 types of dementia, of which Alzheimer's is one.
That discussion goes on at Alzheimer's Research UK and the Alzheimer's Society all the time, because whether to say dementia, but actually
But
the
it's branded,
public...
because Alzheimer's
the
is a
public-
great word, isn't it?
Well,
How
that's
did that
exactly
come from?
right. And the public understand that more than they understand some of the other dementias. And actually...
Mr.
Yeah.
Alzheimer's himself was an interesting man, isn't he?
He
Not
was
Austrian, I think.
Austrian,
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting that over the last year or two, I'm now on the board of Alzheimer's Research UK, which is a great privilege, to see that organisation has grown from 5 million to something like 28 million in
Members or
since
pounds?
22 pounds.
All right. Okay.
Which is for research, so the money's
but
for
what
research.
the hell have
that's
you
very
done with it? I mean,
important.
what have you done with it? Because, you might as well take all the carers on holiday, really. I mean, that's probably do more good.
Yeah.
If you look at if you look at research, right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be blunt about this. We've got 800,000 people with dementia, not
Of whom
just-
my mother is one, so
Okay,
yeah.
and there's be a lot of people watching this
Yeah.
that have got it, and a lot of people in this room. We don't have a hint of a cure. We've got Aricept and something else, the name of which I forget, and which is the best we've got,
Yeah.
which is indifferent at best. I don't get sued by a pharmaceutical company, but you know what I mean.
I do.
We've got no hint of a second generation. I mean, if you think about breast
Yeah.
cancer, for example, we had Herceptin, and since that changed the pathways, and then we
Yeah.
had different drugs, and now they're better drugs. We've got Aricept and the drug I can't remember, where there doesn't seem to be any second generation coming up.
There isn't.
We've got a social services sector which is completely unable
It's
to.
groaning under the stress of this.
And,
it really
and
is.
we're going to have 1 million people with some form of dementia by 2025.
So let me tell you what's
What are
happening.
you doing?
So let me tell you what's happening in here, because I think you mentioned HIV/AIDS before, and so the model of what research is trying to do now in Alzheimer's is taken from that, which is to say we need the private, the public sector to work together, and the third sector, civil society, to work together, and to be not working in siloed areas. And actually, the pharmaceutical companies often work in very siloed ways, and you can understand why, because you've got to make money from the drugs. But of course, the pharmaceuticals are pulling out of Alzheimer's because of these huge drug trials that are failing. So
I think let's look at those. I think I'm right in saying that AstraZeneca had a drug that did second phase trials in China, I think, and that didn't amount to very much. And there's been another.
There's been 3 or 4 over the last couple of years.
Failing.
It's been very, very disappointing.
But it's worth. But I mean, if from the pharmaceuticals company's point of view, we know that a drug for Alzheimer's or dementia would be worth £860 a week, because that's the price of putting someone in the nursing home. we can put a value on it,
Yeah.
multiply that up by 1 million people by 2025, it's a drug worth going down the mines to find.
Well, that's what we believe. And certainly if you look at, we think that some of the drugs probably would work well if we could identify earlier who's at risk.
Right,
Because-
GPs don't
no.
want to do that, do they?
Well, here's where the UK is ahead in this, and this is quite interesting. This is the cohort studies of the MRC. So because of the National Health Service, we have the medical research councils have got these cohort studies of various years, and the 1948 cohort study has got data on 5,000 people from the day they were born until their age now, 68 or something. And so they're such a valuable group of people because no other system has that. So there is now, in the middle of a study that UCL are doing, with a cohort of that cohort study, where they're looking at early intervention. They're looking to say, what does it look like, the people that are now cognitively challenged and look like they'll get Alzheimer's or one of the dementias. So take us back, let's look at all the things that happen to them. And because they've got all the medical stuff as well as all the social things, we ought to be able to draw some inferences around that. And if we can do that, then trying some of the drugs that already exist earlier, a lot of the researchers think might work. So that's one area that's being looked at.
And are there any early signs of hope? Or
Well, there are, I think what's good about the new ways of working, so where internationally researchers are working jointly on this, is they're looking at different hypotheses. So we've had the hypotheses, as you know, of amyloid, which is the sort of tarry, treacly bit in the brain. They're looking at different kinds of hypotheses as well. So they've got several different strings that they're looking at in this area of research, which they didn't have before.
But
it's a challenge.
Actually, it's a kind of national emergency.
It is,
isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of. I mean, unless we try and fix this, we'll get swamped.
That's absolutely true. I mean, people are more frightened of dementia than they are of cancer now, and that does tell you.
Okay, so I'm having a whinge about we're not doing much on the Alzheimer's front, and in the previous part you're explaining what is happening. I mean, just to sort of reconnect this, it's a national emergency. I remember David Cameron thinking he cracked Alzheimer's by having the cabinet given an Alzheimer's briefing, and Andy Tyso, who's one of our Academy ambassadors, did the briefing. You know, and you think, no, David, this is much more important. And I don't think it's crippling for families.
Totally,
and it's more a disease for a family than it is for the individual,
I think
really,
that's
if you can
true.
kind of see it in that context. But we just seem to be letting it all come in, hoping that somebody's going to come up with, we're going to have the Jon Snow moment with the parrot with the pump, and somebody's going to figure out why we all get ill because there's a dirty pump. Students of public health will know what that's all about, and if you don't Google it, Jon Snow public health. But we're not going to get that. And I mean, you know, I think we need, like the Treasury did say, tax breaks for pharmaceutical companies that are investing in this sector.
Yeah.
We need to say to pharmaceutical companies, we won't license anything unless it's come from all of you working together.
Well, and I mean, for example, when I first got involved with Alzheimer's, Wellcome Foundation weren't funding it, which is extraordinary when you think about the challenge. Now they're funding it heavily, as are MRC. So actually the government Wellcome has, and the government are putting a lot more money in, and a lot more private money is going in, and a lot more pharmaceuticals. So in terms of the actual amount of money going into research, there's a whole lot more going in, and it's a lot more strategically being used than it was when it was a little, research project here, somebody like a research project here. There are questions that we're trying to answer, and so research is commissioned in a very different way.
I hope. I mean, I'm very sceptical about these charities that fund the research, and we don't. I mean, I suppose the charities are only formed because they are tough nuts to crack, but I don't ever feel reassured that actually they are working with, white heat to try and crack this
Well,
stuff.
actually, what they've been able to do at Alzheimer's Research UK is bring people together. That's one of them, apart from raising lots of money, they've also been able to bring all of these factors together because they're a third sector organisation. And it's a great thing to be able to do that government seems to find it harder to do, but having them as a sort of kingpin or the central pin to draw in the other people and raise national awareness about it. It has been very good, actually. I think.
You see these ludicrous headlines in the newspaper, drink 6 cups of coffee today and you never get Alzheimer's.
Do you know, I think the Daily Express seems to have an Alzheimer's thing about twice a week.
Yeah.
It was curry this morning.
Oh, was it curry?
Eat curry.
Yeah.
I think it's extraordinary. I mean, why don't we just leave it to the Daily Express? You're wasting your time. Just hand the whole lot over to the proprietors of the Daily Express. Yeah, okay, so fine. So you're still doing that. You're the chairman of another outfit. What is it?
I'm chairman of a small think tank, British Future.
Yeah, I had a look at their website. What the hell does that do?
Oh, it's so interesting. So, immigration.
What's it called? British Future?
British Future, yeah. So actually, British Future was set up by a number of foundations.
Cadbury, you have money from Cadbury, is it?
Barry Cadbury, yeah.
Is that the Cadbury Foundation? Cadbury family?
Barry Cadbury, yes. So basically what happened was that a number of foundations in the USA and in the UK had begun to get concerned about the conversations around immigration. And why wouldn't you? Because, of course, some of them have been particularly bad. And so the idea being that a lot of the organisations that the third sector that cared about these issues were giving out the wrong messages, the campaigning around it wasn't quite right, wasn't hitting the right cause. So they wanted to fund an organisation that could actually work with those organisations but also get different messages out about immigration and integration and opportunity. It is not my field. I am not an expert. I chair it, and the board is full of people who are experts at this, or they're lawyers or whatever. I just sort of hold it together. But I'm very proud of the work because, to give you one example, they produced loads of great stuff, how to talk about immigration for politicians, to say you're doing it wrong, you shouldn't say it this way. And the reason they can do that is that they've done lots of work with the public. And the best example is that British Future's been doing 60 conversations around the UK about immigration, visiting 60 cities, talking to people, setting up citizen panels.
And they're quite tough cities as well.
Very tough cities.
They're not like Milton Keynes or Guildford, are they?
And you should look at this report because the Home Office Select Committee are using the work to inform them about their final report that will come out at the end of the year. And so this little organisation who's working with Hope Not Hate, so it's British Future and Hope Not Hate, partly funded by the Joe Cox Foundation, has been going around the country talking to loads of people and to find out what their views are. And the report's so interesting because what you discover is that actually it's not immigration, it's other stuff that's happening in the town around people coming in. So infrastructure things.
Well, we saw that during the Brexit thing. If you look who voted in and who voted out, you look at the economic envelope where the people are living and the availability of council housing and all that kind of stuff. It's a very complicated thing.
And so we've got under the skin of it a little bit. And Sundar Katwala, who's the CEO, writes very well about all of these things. And so we've had lots of reports recently in the Observer and other, just understanding how people feel and not dissing one side or the other, but just trying to understand it so we can come to a consensus position. And so people can say, what is it we'd really like to see in our immigration system?
Right. Now, I'm mindful of the time. Let's get to the nub of Shirley and her job
Public
now.
health.
Yes. Public health. I mean, let's go from the platform that public health has been a complete bloody disaster it's achieved almost nothing. We're all fat and drinking too much and watching the telly.
Yeah.
What the hell? Why bother?
Oh, that was a sad statement, Roy, and you know this too. But basically, public health in the UK has a lot of different challenges, that's for sure, part of which is systemic. But I'd first like to say how many good things public health has done in the UK. We're considered a world leader in public health.
Okay,
and it's only when I go abroad I hear this.
Well, let's go.
That we are
let's
world
think about,
leaders in public
wait,
health.
wait, let's think about public health. Right, we've got adult literacy, clean water, childhood immunisation, seatbelts in cars, crash helmets, smoking in the workplace, health and safety. It's all the law. We haven't persuaded anybody to do anything.
Okay, so the law is really important. Discuss the law, and I really think this should be sort of number one, is makes a difference. So, for example...
It's the only thing that makes it... Thomas
there are other
Thomas
things that make a
McEwen in
difference.
1969 said the governments have done everything they can with public health, adult literacy, clean water, childhood immunisation. The rest is the extent to which government is prepared to interfere in the lives of ordinary citizens.
Okay, well, and that would seem to be almost a political statement.
Yeah,
The
Thomas
lives of
McEwen,
ordinary
he's your man, isn't he? A big public health guru.
I think there are two things. So from a Royal Society of Public Health point of view, we tend to look, and I think it's the right way to look, at the public's health, not public health. So public health, I know what you're thinking very technically and all of the stuff that we all know about public health that we do, but our concern is around the public's health.
Which is a much wider thing.
Which is a much broader issue.
That's social stuff.
Well, it's
engineering.
really, really important because what we know about health inequalities is absolutely massive.
Inequalities are widening.
Yes.
I mean, almost every public health indicator I can think of, not wishing to be rude or thought of as rude, but every public health indicator I can think of is going in the wrong direction.
Okay, let's take smoking. That's actually
That was the
doing
law.
quite well.
It was Tony Blair.
The law. We've called for smoking exclusion zones in parks and things. So we think the law really works, but that
we can't even stop smoking in hospitals.
I think we have.
Really?
Well, I do find having just come, my husband just having come out, you do find the smokers round the corner of the front doors of the hospital. This is absolutely true. Well, we've got 15% of people smoking, and in the 60s we had 70%.
It's 18%.
Well, it depends how you...
Yes,
we're saying 50,
yeah,
but anyway.
Yeah, it's 18.
So we've done
Just
a
for the
reasonable
record,
job.
18%.
But I agree with you, it's taken too long. It's taken far too long.
Well, it took the law.
It's taken 50 years. And
Look, he took a guy
Yeah.
who had the cojones to take on the establishment, wasn't it? Everyone said Blair wouldn't do it. He did it. I mean, think what you like about Tony Blair, and he's a kind of Marmite guy, and some people love him, some people hate him, but the legacy I choose for him,
and that's a good one,
is millions of lives have been saved through having the balls to prevent smoking in the workplace.
So
what about sugar then?
Well, you've really hit the point of it though, which is so much of this is political.
Sugar,
the sugar tax. George Osborne
what
brought
happened to
that
that?
in. Well, it's the levy is there. 430 million supposedly that's going to provide, and that money, so-called, should be going into physical activity, school playgrounds.
Yeah.
However, in the summer...
we all have a gym membership with Virgin and no one goes. Look, we know...
No, this is about public parks, and this is about...
Who's got
stuff
time to
for
go
schools.
to a park? I mean,
but let me finish my point about
middle
the
class
political...
claptrap, surely.
But the political point is that in the summer of 2017, all of a sudden the Department for Education looked and found a big hole in its budget and said, where can we get 300 million for our school budget? And of course they looked at the sugar tax, they looked at the levy. And so what we have to do in public health is be much more disruptive, I think. We need, needs to have a bigger voice
Let's
for the
look at
public's
the
health.
let's look at the structure of it. I mean, thanks to Lansley's lunacy, we smashed up public health, ripped it out of the heart of the NHS, shoved it up the back passage of the town hall, and we're wondering why it doesn't work.
So I'll disagree with you on that, because I think that was the one bit of Andrew Lansley's madness, if you like, that actually was probably the smart thing to do. But what they didn't do, of course, was then decide to fund it. They said, we'll put it with local government, and then we'll just treat it like the rest of local government.
What's happened to AIDS and HIV now, how fractured those services are. Now, it's impossible to manage AIDS and HIV policies now, because it straddles local government, the health service, nobody's got any money, there's no coordination of the policy, it's a nightmare.
Well, so
all those sorts, the gum stuff and the sexual health, all of that very important stuff for young people, young families.
I agree.
Certainly AIDS and HIV, big issue. We're stuck with a dysfunctional system that prevents...
This, this I would agree with. Here we should be talking about health system. And what should a health system do? It should help you be healthy. And then we'd have an illness system for when we're ill. And that's the NHS. And really what we've got is an illness system, not a health system. And a health system would be integrated, it would be place-based, it would understand the social determinants of health. The fact is, if you live in a poor area, your chances of living as long as somebody in a wealthy area, 12 times in some areas.
But
that you're not so.
All this.
We know all this,
We've
and we
known
don't
it for
act
years.
on it.
Don't live on the west side of the town. Live on the east side. It's richer on the east side, and all of that. And travel on the tube, and you lose a year of your life between Knightsbridge and wherever it is. We know all this, but nobody does anything about it. And if the things we could do things about, like sexual health, like AIDS and HIV, those services really have been broken up to make them unmanageable.
Yeah.
And so instead of lobbying like you do to stop people having a chocolate muffin,
I never have lobbied.
I'm sure I have. I've heard you on the wireless talking about chocolate muffins. I'm sure
I could have been talking about
chocolate muffins. Yeah, it's in the Shirley's Bake Off. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, shouldn't you be campaigning to try and get some cohesion to the things that once worked that don't work now?
Well, I think what we need to do is make progress. And I mean, I think there's an argument that sexual health services could go within the NHS, honestly. I think there's a possibility. But there's loads of issues around the public's health that need to be tackled in a very comprehensive way. Childhood obesity is a really good example. So we wait for the strategy finally comes out, and what do we find? The single most important bit that they needed to include is missing. And that bit was advertising, promotions and sponsorship.
Why do you think that?
Well, I think that,
Could it be something to do with lobbying and money?
Exactly. And so your point about Tony Blair and cigarettes was there needs to be braver politicians making these decisions for the public's health. They really do. I mean, some of this is not complicated. Minimum unit pricing for alcohol. Scotland have just done it after the Whisky Association took them to court for 5 years, but that's gone through. Wales will do it. We'll be left here in Westminster unless somebody, we should be doing it. It's not rocket science.
It's not going to
That's
happen
simple.
for the
It's
foreseeable,
cheap
surely, is it? Because everybody's preoccupied with Brexit. There won't be any parliamentary time, really.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean,
so we're stuck for the next 5 years.
Let's look at the opportunities around that. Well, I don't think they can keep arguing that when the evidence builds up, because I think at some point the population wants to see some movement on other things.
Well, we've got evidence-free policy up till now. I don't think why we need evidence now. What country, in your experience, does public health well? Where do you think is the kind of except? Where are aside from countries who have got an entirely different diet, because they live in a different climate and all the rest of it, where is there? Let's look at Europe. Who's healthy in Europe?
Okay, so I think you can pick off issues actually in Europe, but Scandinavia, you would say, overall, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and the reason is that infrastructure across poverty is better than anywhere else.
It's not that it's cold and miserable there.
Cold and miserable, but people happy.
If you're watching
and
this,
they're in, and you know, their structure, their welfare state, if you like, works properly. You just have to take immunisation.
And they pay for it.
And they pay for it, and they don't mind paying for it.
If you look in Sweden, taxes in Sweden are, for most people, are around 50% of your income.
But they understand the importance of the issue. So if you talk about immunisation in Sweden, they will talk about the fact that there might be a child down the street with leukemia, and so who can't be immunised, and so all the children round that child need to be immunised to protect. The herd immunity stuff is well understood. They have 98% coverage. It's extraordinary. Here, it's about my child. So, you know, we've had all the, you know, problems with the anti-vaxxers, etc. And I think it's all pushing up again now. But what I'm saying is they've got that.
What about you can't take the
mindset.
kid? You can't put your kids in school unless they've been immunised.
I think I would be very pro that. I think we need to have some rules around things like that, because we know that immunisations work. I mean, we'd be sitting here with all sorts of diseases if we, you know, if immunisations didn't work. And we've been massively in favour. Actually, we think HPV for boys, we've been advocating that. So I would say overall, Scandinavia, but if you look at drug policy and look at Portugal, so Portugal have taken a health harm approach to drugs, and they've got much less drug problem there.
So people know what they're doing in Portugal, they've actually effectively legalised.
Yeah, legalised personal possession, but they've also taken a health approach. So we produced a report called Taking a New Line on Drugs a couple of years ago, and we were all slightly worried about it because we thought, well, this is quite controversial in the sense that we examined all the evidence, we talked to people abroad, all the stakeholders, and we produced a report that came out with, you know, what a health harms policy would look like, i.e. that drug policy should be put together with alcohol, with tobacco, in the same group, and should be with the Department of Health. There's no business being with the Home Office. Now, the police support this, and many of the police and crime commissioners support this. So we felt, you know, that we were following the tide. It really is a very good report, and we've been following through on that. And so these are the kind of things that would make a big difference here. And we look at somewhere like Portugal, crime's gone down. I mean, deaths have gone down. All of the, you know, they've moved the indicators in a really positive way. And we're not treating poor addicts as criminals. We're treating them as people who need to have support with their health.
Do you know, I mean, there's obviously a brave political decision. Do you know what public attitudes were like before? Did they have a fight with the public to do this?
No, not particularly. And I think I don't think we would hear. So what happened when our report came out? It got a lot of publicity, but we had for the first time 2 editorials: the Times front page and the Times editorial, saying the time had come to do this. Martin Wolf in the FT did a whole half page on it, saying it was one of the best reports he'd read because it made total sense in policy terms. So for us, it was saying not the usual suspects are talking about drugs policy. So we got it onto the radar of people who decision makers and politicians listen to. And that's an example, I think, of moving things forward. I mean, I honestly believe, probably won't be while I'm still around in the role, if you like, but I think this will happen because it makes sense and the evidence is there, but the political will isn't there. So all the commentators, right and left, think this is a good policy. The only people that don't seem to are in the Home Office. So when you've got the police behind you and the police and crime commissioners, you have to.
Well, I suppose
you know it's about politics.
The politicians think, well, where are the votes going to come from? They'll do, you know, and that means you've got to soften up public opinion, haven't you? Before, so the politicians feel safe. I mean, Blair didn't do that with smoking. I mean, I'm not sure where the smoking thing actually came from. but he just kind of did it.
Brilliant.
And it wasn't, there wasn't a huge consultation over it, was it? They just did it, and they had the big enough majority in the House of Commons
to do it. I mean, evidence was so clear, and there's so much evidence, and that's why evidence on its own is never enough. So anything that we put out and the work that we do has the evidence, but it also has what the public think. We don't put anything out in our reports or our press that doesn't have a big public component, because we've gone and asked people what they think. We've asked the public, what do you think? We make recommendations, we ask them, what do you think about this recommendation? Do you think that would work? And so what we're trying to do is create a dialogue with the public, not the finger wagging, nanny state, but the let's have a conversation about this. So another good example was last year we did status of mind, hashtag status of mind, social media and young people's mental health. And this is an emerging issue, so there's some evidence, but what we really needed to do was to find out what young people think. So we bothered to ask 2,000 young people what they thought.
And what do they think?
We asked them actually, which was really interesting. We did a league table of the platforms, and we said, of these 14 questions, which how would you rate the platforms in terms of your health and well-being, the positive and the negative? So, it was quite a well-balanced report. And of course, YouTube was the most popular, best for your health and well-being, and Instagram was the least, because the issues that young people are concerned about here is we're concerned about sleep, body image, depression, anxiety and cyberbullying. So these are on the negative side. On the positive, there's all those communities you can be in touch with, people who might have your condition. Suddenly you can talk to different people. You can create your own friend group, if you like. You can find great information. So that there's a whole host of good things about it. And our point in the report was to say, let's think about how to mitigate the bad stuff, the negative things, make some recommendations, and let's see how we can enhance the good things about social media.
The social media thing is really important. I mean, so often you find organisations like yours say, "Oh, we've got a website, and you can look it up on everything." No, try Facebook. You might get somebody to look at it. Yeah. It's a whole different thing. If you could change one thing, what would you change?
Oh goodness!
One big public health thing. What would it be? It's tough, isn't it?
It's actually about politicians being willing to engage in this area. Because, I mean...
What about, suppose we took the politicians out of it and said, if you did crowdsourcing style approaches to questions, so if you said to people, for example, should we have a chocolate muffin tax or something,
We do know that tax works and financial incentives work.
Do you think so?
Well... the evidence shows that they do, so that's why we want, that's why minimum unit pricing.
Does the evidence really show? I mean, does it not just disadvantage people on low incomes anyway?
Well, the MUP is about the horrible white cider, and I mean that's the bit of the market that actually really needs to be got rid of, and is you can get these drums of cheap cider for £3 or something. And guess what? Every place that sells it is always round the corner from a hot bail hostel or somewhere. That's what you want to get rid of.
It's the interconnectedness of our lives, isn't it? That I'll come back to your thing.
Yeah, no,
but I mean, it's the interconnectedness of our lives that is the sum total of the public's health.
So what I'd really like to see...
So is it too difficult?
Yes. No. I think what we really need to do is look at it the other way around. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the NHS, having had my husband just in hospital for 8 days with his broken femur.
You pushed him under a lorry, didn't you? What did you do? What's happened? He's fallen
off his bike.
Is the bicycle damaged?
Well,
because they're very expensive.
His second best bicycle didn't have that much damage. It was only to his leg that it got really.
God,
thank
right.
God, that's what
Thank God the bike's all right.
Yeah.
Just give him some thought. You just unwrap the wet towel around her head, and she's going to tell us what's the magic answer. Because public health, just to recap, public health is the sum total of interconnectedness in our lives, our habits, and our way of life. So is it too difficult to unpick?
No, I think what we really need to do is, and you've written about a lot of this, Roy, is to create, we need to think about a health system being as healthy for as long as we can. And we need to create all of our policies and practices around that. So we need to sort of turn the Titanic a bit and start investing in early years in some of the areas where we know, people are dying young.
Sure Start was good, wasn't it?
Sure Start was excellent. I mean, we start these good programs, then we start the early years investment. I mean, the district nurses, the health visitors, numbers are all going in the wrong direction. Local government have lost $500 million in 5 years. Now, whatever you say, that is quite a lot of money. The NHS needs more money, but it got 2.8 billion in autumn. So we're not investing anything in prevention. And unless we really think about that, it isn't just the money, it's the money and a cultural mindset. So I think looking at what can we do in place, I have real hopes for what's happening in Manchester, because they are looking in an integrated way across the system. And it needs to be around community support, it needs to be cradle to grave, it needs to be, across the life course, and of course we need to, the integrated health and social care, we need to do something really significant.
Are you hopeful of that? I mean, it seems to me that Jeremy Hunt's going to change the title on the note paper, but to do anything, to think about it, we're all running away with saying, oh, this is a great idea, but if you think about it, we've got to change the departmental expenditure limit, which means legislation. Mm-hmm. It means that we've got to, if we've got the money, we're going to have to employ the people. It means we've got to 2P people across to where, not CCGs because they're all disappearing. Who hosts them? They go into hospitals. What happens? And now he's paused accountable care organisations because everybody's frightened of losing the judicial review. Yeah. So. It's not that easy, is it?
It isn't that easy, but you need the political will. It's a massive problem. The Barker Commission in 2014 argued... Just so people know, the Barker Commission was written by Kate Barker.
For the King's Fund, where we're broadcasting from tonight. Yeah. But a great report. But it was always going to be a shelf filler.
One budget, a single budget, looking together. So if it's problematic, so many things are a problem. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it because it's difficult. Oh, and actually, one of the things I think about that I learnt in the States, and I think is really harder here, is that we are so good at analysing the problem. I mean, I could, in this building particularly, take millions of reports, things that have been written again and again, the same kind of things, but actually actioning it, we don't take enough risks. I mean, one thing I learned being in New York was that you really need to recognise that you might fail, and that's okay, because you'll learn something through that failure. But you will get it right eventually. And here, I don't know what it is. There's something about the fear of failure, or the fear of not being 100%, that just seems, to hold us back from the actions that we know are right. Because you take anything, stuff you've written, everybody's written, we know what needs to be done. So somebody needs to grasp that mantle.
Perhaps I'll just stop writing about it. No, right, we have some questions, I know. Gentlemen, just tell us who you are and just make your comment.
So I'm Mike Robinson. I'm Director of Public Health at Westminster City Council.
He's sitting in Ermine.
I may be the only fellow of the Faculty of Public Health here. So first of all, you're absolutely right to be a harsh critic of what we've achieved so far. You're right, most public health indicators are moving in the wrong direction. We need people like you to actually come over to the dark side. So every time you write about public health, I am delighted that you are raising the profile of these very important issues. So we have a number of heroes over the century, the 150 years in public health, who aren't public health specialists. So I think someone that we need to think very carefully about and support is Graham Allen, the Early Intervention Foundation, the idea that we can actually help people be better parents, that young people can grow up with greater self-esteem and that they can make their own choices. It's not a question of nannying, it's a question of actually creating an environment where people can make healthy choices. So you're right, there's a long way to go, but no political party, no politician wants fat kids, no one wants people dying of strokes. It's a noble cause, Roy. Come on board and help us do it better.
This is the end of my career as a contrarian.
Career.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it just seems to me a piece of business logic. You know, we're running a business here. We've got too many customers and not enough money. We've got to kind of go upstream and stop stuff happening. It just seems to me to be so logical. Has anybody else got a comment or something? Yes, ma'am. Just tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Annette, and in my spare time, I'm chair of a charity called Social Action for Health that operates in North East London, and they do some amazing work.
Jolly fine charities too. To give £5, text. Yeah,
they're integrating with all the communities there, doing health management programs, but the money is drying out from the local authorities, from the CCGs, and any money that there is, commissioners aren't making decisions on because they're tying themselves in knots about the STPs and Tower Hamlets together. And I'm honestly not sure if the charity is going to survive this integration period. So if you were me, thinking back to your sort of fundraising days in America and everything you did there, do you have any advice on what to do?
It's very interesting. How do the local people feel about it? Do you have a lot of support in the community?
Yes.
Okay, so come and have coffee with me and we'll have a chat about it, because I think there are things you can do, particularly if you've got people behind you, and get some. But actually, this is something that
how many charities like you are there in the area as well?
Oh, so many that are completely against the line, really up against it.
Well, then a part of that, I mean, we, Terry and I, the blonde, did some work with the bowel cancer charities, where there were, how many were there, Terry?
Double figures.
Double figures and they're all trying to do the same thing, coming from a slightly different angle, and we managed to get them all in one room. And that was my lifetime achievement. We got them in the same room and we left them in the same room and let them get on with it. But actually they've now...
Well, two of the biggest bowel cancer charities have now merged and are working.
wow.
I mean, I can't take the credit for it, but we created the environment. So if you can create the environment where people come together, have a common purpose, if not necessarily a shared purpose, but a common purpose in what you do, cut your back office costs and then start crowdsourcing money.
That's one way. I mean, one thing that we were wanting to do, and we're trying to do at the moment, is to create some different models, because we do the Health and Wellbeing Awards, and so we see some amazing organisations in all sorts of areas across the UK who are doing great things in health and wellbeing, many of whom are exactly in your position. So what we wanted to do is create a social investment fund for the public's health, so that organisations who are showing an impact and who lots of DPHs, Directors of Public Health and others, want to survive and are worried about not surviving, that we look and figure out new business models, social enterprise models and other ways, because I think there are ways of doing that, and we're still fighting for that. So we're doing it. We've done a feasibility study, and it looks like we'll be taking it to the next stage. So more later.
Phil
Hawthorne, I run a leadership company as well as I'm a bit of a cook.
He's written a book called Men Can Cook.
Really?
Can Men Cook? It's very good, and I'm living proof they can't. Yes.
Roy used to be fat and unfit.
And look how marvellous he's looking.
Do you have a question?
55. I do have a question. The question is, you've mentioned an awful lot of reports, Shirley.
Yeah.
Like 16 that I can.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Gosh, we have done.
Is it about nudging, or is it about action? Because I haven't heard anything that's made things happen.
Okay, so, well, I wouldn't quite say that. Our Health on the High Street report, which I didn't mention, which is 2015, I think.
17.
No, 2015 was Health on the High Street.
17 reports.
And 17 reports. But basically what that did was to have a look at the infrastructure. It said, actually what we were fed up with was, at that time, everything was about individual responsibility, and of course, you know, we understand that's really important, but there was nothing about the infrastructure stuff. The fact is that if you're in a poorer community, you know, your high streets, we use that as a proxy really, to gain attention. And that report, we highlighted the 10 healthiest and unhealthiest high streets in the UK, and then in the London boroughs, we highlighted the healthiest high streets and unhealthiest. And guess what? The poorest communities had the unhealthiest high streets. Since that report came out, we did a lot of recommendations around local authorities having more control, around licensing, planning, around looking at their high streets, about being able to design in health and those kind of things. And a number of local authorities have taken that up. And payday lenders, who are our worst people on the high street, on our Richter scale of health, they were a -4, which is very bad. Payday lending, many of them are now off the high street, and the Financial Conduct Authority has, as you know, clamped down on them. And one of the reasons, it wasn't the only, but one was that it was highlighted, bookmakers and payday lenders were highlighted in that report, and it got commented upon in all areas. So sometimes it does do things. As an organisation, we do training, we do quals, we do other things.
Well, I don't know what it is.
Beyond
I mean,
that,
if you think about the planning powers that local authorities have, they're very limited in what they can grant a planning consent to. You know, if someone can get a betting licence to open a betting shop, it's very difficult for the councillors, and having been a councillor, it's very difficult to say no to a legitimate, legalised. So if Ladbrokes come and want to be next to Bet365, there are almost no powers, because you can't choose between commercial organisations.
Well, so that's one of the things that we've been trying to change, and we've been working on this. In fact, I am the bête noire of the
Bet365.
The British Bookmakers Association, because they didn't like being called out as unhealthy on the high street. We called out the clustering, and we've been a major component of the fixed odd betting terminal campaign, because we saw quite clearly from their balance sheets that, you know, 50% of their income is from the fixed odd betting terminals. So if those go down to the £2 limit, a lot more betting shops will be closing. It got, you know, let's hope. Again, this is a political decision that needs to be taken.
I mean, the other thing is that so much of the betting now is done on the phone.
Online.
On your phone.
So much issues online.
You know, in the middle of a football game, you could say, you know, will the next corner be Chelsea or Man U? You think, well, I'll have a fiver on that. You can see how people slip into it, can't you?
A lot of students.
But the trouble, you see, there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with having the odd drink. And there's nothing wrong with the chocolate
we
muffin.
Would not be
but it's where do you get to the point where it is wrong?
So it's
and
the
how you
dialogue.
interfere in people's lives.
Yeah.
Thomas McEwen, 1969, he was right.
So,
Terry, what have you got?
Well, I just think there's the obviously the Alzheimer's and the dementia has caused a lot of comments on Twitter. No, in a positive way. But Andy Tyso, otherwise on Twitter @DementiaBoy, who Roy mentioned, has said, Shirley, what can you do to help with this fake dementia news that doesn't help anybody? And he's done I don't know if I can show the picture. He's done a montage of all the fake news headlines from the papers all around dementia care, giving false hope to people on a weekly basis. And he's just saying, what more can we do to?
What about you taking the press complaints people, waking them up, rattling their cage?
Well, it really is interesting. I'd love to see that if Andy would like to send it to me, because I share it with the press at Alzheimer's Research UK.
I'm just going to show it to you
it.
on the screen now.
You've got one in here, Andy. I can tell you. Well done.
Every single one.
And people just take the headline and don't read down to the bit where the researchers say, no, there's no evidence in this, because that's at paragraph 4. And so, you know, let me take that on board. And I'd love to see that and take to Alzheimer's Research UK, because actually they're very good at press. And I do think that this is the false hope bit. You know, having a mother with dementia I agree with Roy that it's really a family. It ends up being a family tragedy. It's just awful when. So just before Christmas, I went to visit my mother, and for the first time, she didn't recognise me. That's a horrible day, when for the first time you could see that she really didn't know who I was. I'm only one person, but there are thousands and thousands of people who go through this.
Yeah.
Right, listen, unless anybody else has got something to say, you've got a fabulous boss, haven't you? I bet you didn't know about all that, yeah? And you've got a very good communications guy as well.
Yeah.
I'm
Who
hoping,
is, by the way,
yeah.
Duncan is, look out tomorrow, because we have a new report coming out, Right 18, and it's called Labelling the Point, and it's about, we have mocked up, and Ed's over there who wrote it, and we have been looking at what we think a good label would look like post-Brexit, because we will have some power on that, and the right kind of information. We've obviously talked to the public about it, and we think that could nudge and help behaviour, because we think that people have the right to good, easily accessible information.
But there'd be a label,
and then it's
on
their
my,
choice.
label on my chocolate muffins. What I'm talking about.
Never on your chocolate muffin. You're allowed a chocolate muffin as long as you don't have 12. I think there's something about moderation. So. Oh,
really? I thought if you just binge, it didn't count. And your communications guy is very, I have to say, who is
on his way to Salford to be our BBC breakfast tomorrow morning, talking about our labelling.
Because I was going to offer him a job. I mean, he'd like to come and work for us.
I have a great team. I mean, actually, fantastic staff. So I'm really proud of them.
Listen, if you're watching at home on the sofa or whatever it is, for God's sake, get up and get active. Don't let Shirley see you sitting down. We send Carl our love.
Thank you.
We normally give our guests a little gift, which I love this. We give our guests a gift. It is, John's got it there. Bring it over, John. There's a good chap. It's a bottle of scotch. Now the thing
is, a bottle of Welsh.
Yeah,
a bottle of Welsh.
Now the thing is, regulars will know that this is Welsh whiskey. Okay, and. It is the finest whiskey in the world. I'm sorry if you're watching in Scotland, but it's Welsh whiskey. And we always give it to our guests, partly because it is quite expensive and is above the threshold to have to declare interest with. So if you check Jeremy Hunt's register of interest, you'll find he's got a bottle of our scotch. But more important tonight, we think that you probably want to take that home and give it to your poor, wounded old man.
And I will say that I do like malt whiskey. It was my father's favourite drink.
Well, you will like that, because that's proper whiskey.
Don't drink it very often or very much, but I do really like it. So thank you so much.
The public health message tonight is have a drop of scotch. Right, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Shirley Cramer.